Welcome to the Fall of Civilization. I'm your host, James Gilbert, and this is American Contrarian. This week in the apocalypse, the headlines are: King Charles steps onto the world stage with a global climate war speech. Jen Psaki gets COVID while fully vaxxed, and her replacement announces a January 4th deadline for the vaccine mandate. Project Veritas is raided by the FBI. Walmart is secretly stealing from you. Florida has the lowest COVID rate in the country. Stores are quietly taking down mask signs and ignoring the mandate. The House passed the infrastructure bill at $1.2 trillion. And finally, the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse has begun. Our first story, Prince Charles's climate war speech. Following the G20 summit, Prince Charles made a speech that will eventually be infamous. At the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, he said we must take a warlike footing towards global warming because time has literally run out. The population is too large for the planet to sustain, and, well, just listen to him yourself.
Greater existential threat, to the extent that we have to put ourselves on what might be called a warlike footing. As we tackle this crisis, our efforts cannot be a series of independent initiatives running in parallel. The scale and scope of the threat we face call for a global systems-level solution based on radically transforming our current fossil fuel-based economy to one that is genuinely renewable and sustainable. Here we need a vast military-style campaign to marshal the strength of the global private sector, with trillions at its disposal, far beyond global GDP, and with the greatest respect, beyond even the governments of the world's leaders. It offers the only real prospect of achieving fundamental economic transition. So,
fundamental economic transition. Global regulations on carbon are needed to save the planet. To have functional global regulations, you need a global government body, a world government. You might call it a new world order, capable of organizing a vast military-style campaign. This is how Prince Charles is going to reinvent himself and begin to step out of his mother's shadow and take his place as king. He is aligning himself with the heads of corporations because the royal family feels the winds of change and knows it's now more important to have CEOs legitimizing you than presidents and prime ministers. Over the 20th century, the royal family took a very resigned position on the global stage. Their power, or lack thereof, was famously mocked by the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen in the 1970s, and from that point on, the question, why do we still have a monarch, began being asked more frequently in Britain, until shortly after the end of that century, when jihadist attacks against the West began to change the sentiment towards them, and they stood as a classically British institution. Except the royal family isn't actually British at all, and does not care about the British people in the slightest. They care about power, and if religious friction is benefiting them, of course they support massive immigration to their country. If they brought in enough Muslims, they could just convert to Islam themselves and rule with as much authority as the king of Saudi Arabia. Monarchies are all good in Islam. As far as the royal family is concerned, the Brits robbed them of the power that was rightfully theirs over 300 years ago with that pesky Bill of Rights. If they can use global warming to get around those, they will, and that is what this speech is a declaration of. Charles just let the leaders of the world know he will be taking a much more active role than his mother ever did once he becomes king. On to our next story. COVID vax mandate goes into effect January 4th, announced by Jen Psaki's replacement because she is in quarantine with COVID after being fully vaxxed. I know what you're thinking. Doesn't that seem like a massive contradiction that no reasonable government could attempt? And you are right. No reasonable government would. They don't care that the vaccine doesn't work, that the fact that the White House press secretary can't even make this announcement because she is contagious with the very disease the vaccine is supposed to prevent her from contracting is not at all a contradiction, because the vaccine is a litmus test for whether or not you're an authoritarian. It has nothing to do with COVID. If you are willing to get an injection every 6 months that is clearly ineffective and could be dangerous, they're pretty sure you will never stand up against anything wrong that the people in power are doing. Project Veritas raided by the FBI. James O'Keefe was hit with a gag order to silence him that has zero legal grounds. Keefe is doing what's right, though, and ignoring it, and releasing this statement.
Myself at great risk because on November 4th, Project Veritas came under attack. I awoke to the news that apartments and homes of Project Veritas journalists, or former journalists, had been raided by FBI agents. It appears the Southern District of New York now has journalists in their sights for the supposed crime of doing their jobs lawfully and honestly, or at least this journalist. I had to think long and hard before making this statement. It's a decision that only I can make. They don't want me to defend myself and immediately try to silence me. That's why the cover letter to the grand jury subpoena we received contains this language. Quote, "The government hereby requests that you voluntarily refrain from disclosing the existence of the subpoena to any third party. While you are under no obligation to comply with our request, we are requesting you not to make any disclosure in order to preserve the confidentiality of the investigation, and because the disclosure of the existence of this investigation might interfere with and impede the investigation." Unquote. But while the Department of Justice requested us to not disclose the existence of the subpoena, something very unusual happened. Within an hour of one of our reporters' homes being secretly raided by the FBI, the New York Times, who we are currently suing for defamation, contacted the Project Veritas reporter to ask for comment. We do not know how the New York Times was aware of the execution of a search warrant at our reporter's home or the subject matter of the search warrant, as a grand jury investigation is secret. The FBI took materials of current former Project Veritas journalists, despite the fact that our legal team previously contacted the Department of Justice and voluntarily conveyed unassailable facts that demonstrate Project Veritas' lack of involvement in criminal activity and or criminal intent. Like any reporter, we regularly deal with the receipt of source information and take steps to verify its authenticity, legality, and newsworthiness. Our efforts were the stuff of responsible, ethical journalism, and we are in no doubt that Project Veritas acted properly at each and every step. However, it appears journalism itself may now be on trial. Late last year, we were approached by tipsters claiming they had a copy of Ashley Biden's diary. We had never met or heard of the tipsters. The tipsters indicated the diary had been abandoned in a room in which Ms. Biden stayed at the time, and in which the tipsters stayed in temporarily after Ms. Biden departed the room.
Enough.
The tipsters indicated that the diary included explosive allegations against then-candidate Joe Biden. The tipsters indicated that they were negotiating with a different media outlet for the payment of monies for the diary. The tipsters were represented by
I guess that was the final straw. I'm sure that they had already been under investigation after reporting on Pfizer and the public school system and everything else that Project Veritas has uncovered over the years. But the final straw was getting a hold of the president's daughter's diary. And this is just the latest in a stream of illegal actions against journalists covering real news. Alex Jones has been found guilty in 2 or 3 trials regarding the Sandy Hook stuff, where the courts are saying he's responsible for damages, which is all with the intention of bankrupting him and making it impossible for him to have time or resources to do the work that he's doing. The NSA and FBI are reading Tucker Carlson's emails, as he reported on his show about a month ago. To be honest, I'm surprised that none of these guys have committed suicide like Jeffrey Epstein yet, but I'm sure that's the next step. Alright, next story. Florida has the lowest COVID rate and death rate in the country, and it is being ignored by the media. Let's take a listen to the Wall Street Journal, so you know I'm not getting this from some fringe source.
Media ignore Florida COVID recovery. Journalists credited Gavin Newsom for a similar turnaround but won't stop vilifying Ron DeSantis. By Dave Seminara. October 31st, 2021, 5:43 p.m. Eastern Time. St. Petersburg, Florida. Florida went from having the country's highest rate of COVID infections to the lowest in about 2 months. Does the turnaround illustrate that infection rates are cyclical and often affected by weather? Is Florida's infection rate lower than in states with significantly higher vaccination rates and mandates? Are those policies futile or counterproductive? Are Floridians now close to herd immunity? I don't know the answers to those questions, in part because journalists are less interested in asking them than in bashing Governor Ron DeSantis. An October 25th New York Times article on declining COVID cases nationwide failed to mention Florida, the state with the country's most dramatic improvement. Instead, the paper's David Lee and Hart emphasized that Republicans have lower vaccination rates than Democrats. Recent coverage of declining COVID rates in the Washington Post and CNN also failed to mention Florida's turnaround. The CNN story made a point of noting that white evangelical Protestants were among the least likely adults to get vaccinated. Bloomberg's Timothy O'Brien penned an October 26th analysis piece that accused Mr. DeSantis of replacing sound public policy making with political theatrics in the COVID-19 era, but ignored the improvement in COVID numbers. MSNBC injected race into an October 25th hit piece headlined like Trump, DeSantis uses blackface to mask his COVID failures. The author, Jahan Jones, disparaged Florida's Nigeria-born Surgeon General, Joseph Ladapo, as a reliable tool used in support of Governor Ron DeSantis' dangerously poor pandemic response. Dr. Ladapo has written about COVID for these pages.
Alright, so, yeah, and I'm not sure if this is related or not, but stores here in Reno, Nevada are quietly taking down their mask signs and ignoring the mandate. So, that's beautiful. It's very nice to breathe actual air again. Not that I haven't been breathing actual air. I have a mesh mask that I wear whenever I go out, whenever they tell me to put one on. I recommend you get one too. Just look up fake mask. You'll find it. Now for the $1.2 trillion House infrastructure bill. We're reading from NPR today, National Propaganda Radio. This was written by Barbara Sprunt on November 6th. Which is today. After months of tense negotiations, the House of Representatives has passed a $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill, 228 to 206, fulfilling a major priority for President Biden's domestic agenda and cementing a political victory for Democrats. The measure includes significant investments in roads, bridges, railways, and broadband internet. It passed late Friday night, largely along party lines, with 13 Republicans joining 215 Democrats in support of the legislation. But the bill also saw 6 progressive Democrats vote against it because a larger social spending measure failed to secure enough support for a floor vote on Friday. Last minute agreements. The late-night vote on infrastructure followed an agreement between factions of the Democratic Party as moderate members issued further assurances that they would pass the larger spending bill when it comes up for a vote. We commit to voting for the Build Back Better Act in its current form as expeditiously as we receive fiscal information from the Congressional Budget Office, but in no event later than the week of November 15th, consistent with the top lines for revenues and investments in the White House framework. A key group of the 5 moderates, Representatives Ed Case, Democrat of Hawaii, Josh Gottheimer, Democrat New Jersey, Stephanie Murphy from Florida, Kathleen Rice, New York, and Kurt Schrader, Oregon, all Democrats, said in a statement. The group added that if CBO score is inconsistent with the White House framework, they remain committed to working to resolve any discrepancies in order to pass Build Back Better legislation. Blah, blah, blah. It goes on for a while, and then it says that they're going to be using the extra money from the COVID-19 pandemic, and the CBO has predicted the bill will add about $256 billion to the projected deficit over the next 10 years, which is a vast underrepresentation of how much it's going to cost us. Policy provisions, roads, trains, public transit, airports, ports, transportation safety programs, electric vehicles, zero and low emission buses and ferries, revitalization of communities, broadband, power infrastructure, clean drinking water, resilience and western water storage, removal of pollution from water and soil. I mean, look, if that's all it was actually going to be, that all sounds good. But how much of this is waste? And I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world if that's really all that's in it, but I'm reading this from NPR, so I doubt it. Kyle Rittenhouse trial has begun. In case you're unfamiliar, Kyle Rittenhouse shot two men in self-defense during the George Floyd riots. The entire incident was caught on video and was clearly self-defense. The fact that he's even facing charges is a miscarriage of justice. Now, I've heard from sources that know more than I do that he could have a far better defense attorney. And it appears he may be getting taken advantage of by his representation. But because the prosecution's case is so weak, if this is a fair trial at all, I think he will get off. And honestly, I think he will get off. This is a more cut and dry case than the Derek Chauvin one, with a lot less baggage. Derek Chauvin's case was much more ceremonious. It wasn't just him on trial, but every cop who'd ever taken the life of someone in the line of duty that probably could have been avoided. Kyle Rittenhouse is not a police officer, so I don't think the hatred toward him will affect the case as much. He's a 17-year-old kid who shot a pedophile and somebody else with a long criminal history, I believe. I truly hope he gets off. I think he will. And a final short story of the day. Check your checks at Walmart, 'cause they're stealing from you. Apparently, I'm getting this from a friend of mine on Facebook, Walmart is listing items at one price, and then when you get up to the register and cash out, you're being charged significantly different prices. If you notice and take your receipt up to the returns area, they will give you your cash back and stuff, but according to the Facebook post that I'm thinking of, it's happening frequently, and the managers appear to be well aware of it. So, check your checks, check your bills, you're getting robbed. That's it for this week, folks. Take care of yourself during the apocalypse.